Welcome back for AP Bio. This is lecture number 16, which is going to deal with the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And in particular, we're going to look at how do we know when evolution is occurring or when is evolution not occurring. And it turns out there are ways that we can actually figure that out. So we have some learning objectives that go with this and some references from the book. Hooray. So there are two individuals. One's named Hardy, one is named Weinberg or Weinberg. And what they did was independently came up with a way of mathematically explaining whether or not there's evolution occurring. And what they agreed upon, both of them independently, was that there are 5 things that must happen. And as long as these 5 things happen, evolution does not occur. We're at what we would call an equilibrium, where we don't see anything changing. Those 5 things are: there's no natural selection, you have a large population, migration doesn't really happen, meaning if you have an organism leave, it also has to come back. There's no net mutations, meaning if something were to change, you have to change it back. And there's random reproductive patterns. So when we look at this, there are a few things that we haven't dealt with. One of those would be something called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a nice way of saying a sampling error, meaning the sample size that you're taking from is so small that there is no overall pattern. It's just randomness every single time. Kind of like if you were to take out of a bag of M&Ms, if the bag of M&Ms is too small, you don't notice the pattern. But if you have enough M&Ms, maybe the percentages that people expect, maybe that is really what happens. It's an issue of you don't have enough organisms. And what you turn out to get is the chaos of reproduction overwhelms the pattern of natural selection. We see this in a few ways. One of those is what we call a bottleneck, meaning something drives down the population to being really small, hence large population having to be forced through the neck of a bottle. The other one is what we would call a founder's effect, which is a new or a small chunk of the original population lands somewhere else and they're not necessarily representative. That would be, you need large populations. The net migration thing deals with what we call gene flow. And that would be if you introduce new organisms into a population, you're introducing new characteristics into there. And if you have them leave, you're removing characteristics. You're removing options or adding options. That is going to allow for the population to change. The mutations is weird, so we're going to ignore that one. But the randoms reproduction deals with something that we call sexual selection. And that is where there are patterns in what you choose to reproduce with. So this has to do with reproductive choice. And that choice is a selection. It's kind of like us with artificial selection, just it's not humans making those calls. The way that we demonstrate all of this stuff is using math. And the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the HWE, is demonstrated using some things that we call alleles, which is a very nice way of saying we're talking about components that you inherit, and that's what we're going to be talking about next after we deal with a little bit of reproduction. But we can mathematically explain or describe this thing that we call the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And this math here looks really odd. Actually, it looks probably really simple, but we're going to deal with this later, and it should make sense. Since we can quantify this stuff, what that allows us to do is actually figure out if evolution has occurred or not. So we can actually sit there and look to say, is what I expect to happen what really is happening? So we could do that a few ways. We could do this by using chi-square analysis, where I expect ratios to be one way, and then if I'm not seeing that, oh, that means something's happening, that the status quo is not what it should be. The result is evolution, and we could test that using chi-square. There's another way we can do it, and that would be dealing with error bars. And we can compare befores and afters, and if the standard deviations turn out to overlap, or pardon me, not standard deviations, the standard errors aren't overlapping, well, then I suppose we can say that the groups are finally different. Is this really what people do? Well, here's an example of it, and this came from the Journal of Nature from 2005. You can see the reference up at the top. But what we can do is we can actually measure if evolution is actually happening. And we can test that or verify it using statistics. And the statistics that we use come from the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium.